Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and this is another of our innovator conversations. We've got Bruce Nagy, who is the author of The Clean Energy Age, a new book it's a guide to beating climate change. I think it's exactly the right time to be publishing this book and having a conversation about it. Welcome to the show, Bruce. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, and thanks for having me.
Well, I read the book last week. I got a review copy, and it's fascinating, and it's comprehensive. There's an awful lot here. You did a great job with it, and you've covered what I think is the real question about sustainability is there's a lot of different approaches to it. There's not one solution. So you broke it down for homeowners, business owners, people in government and policymakers, teachers and media, and so forth. You created top 10 action lists for each of them, and all this is a great place to jump in and start. But I want to start with a question that begins with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out on Monday from the UN, which says we have about 12 years to really turn this thing around. Given this new, and of course we knew it before, but once again we're hearing it, urgent call for action, what are the top things that people need to be looking at to change their carbon footprint today?
Well, I think it's a great topic related to this book. And before I jump into particular things that they could be doing, I think what we need to understand is we are out of time. And because we're running out of time, we need to focus more. And as you said, it's one problem with a lot of different solutions, but that doesn't help us as humans. It's much better for us if we can focus on a few things, a few simple things, and break it down from there. So of course I created that. To me, that means top 10 lists, but it also means even less. It means three things, three areas. And that there are three areas that together make up about 70% of our air pollution problems, 70, 75, depending on where you are in the world. And they are buildings, power plants, and vehicles. So I focus on those three, and as you mentioned earlier, buildings are the biggest one. And so I think, obviously the biggest thing that anyone can do if they are associated in any way with the ownership of a building or with the occupancy of a building is to see what they can do to reduce the carbon footprint of that building. And so, because that's, 40% of the world's problem. So it's a double whammy. It has the heating and cooling systems use a certain amount of fuel or energy, and also if it's using a furnace, it also uses some electricity that may or may not be generated by a coal generating plant. So, but yeah, I guess buildings is at the top of my list.
So as a homeowner, I'm in the midst of considering things like windows and putting photovoltaic on the roof. What is your top 10 list for somebody who, our audience is sitting at home thinking about how to improve their house? What would you suggest they focus on first? Well,
I'm glad that you mentioned those two items because those relate very strongly to priorities. Because when we think about, let's go green, we sometimes think about the very fancy, sophisticated systems like solar. And we, if we're a technical geek like I am, we can't wait to put it up there and talk about the technical. But actually the sensible thing to do is to properly fix your envelope first.
Okay.
Because what happens when you fix your building envelope is that the options multiply for what you can do after that, and B, you don't need as much equipment, you don't need as much energy, you don't need as much everything, money included.
So start with insulation.
Start with insulation and windows. You hit it on the head with your windows. Windows are probably the most vulnerable place. And I know that a lot of people are going, oh, wow, well, yeah, I've looked into those windows and they cost a lot for the really good ones. But the good news is that we now have something called zero energy buildings, passive house buildings. These are buildings that are really well sealed along the lines of what we're talking about with insulation and windows. And when you seal a building that well, you don't actually need a furnace in a northern place or a big cooling system in a southern place. So you can take some of that money instead and put it into the envelope.
Right. So, do you think is it a good idea to do the windows before the insulation, or do you start with the insulation and move out from there? Because that wall is probably bleeding the most warmth in the house.
Well, I think, there's the theory and then there's the realism. Are you working on a retrofit or a new build? Like it sounds like you're talking about a retrofit. And so if it's a retrofit, it's going to, I guess it depends. It depends on what needs to be done the most. And it also depends on what the trade-offs are. And there are many, because for example, if you're in a downtown location and you have a building that you don't really want to rip all the walls out and gut the whole place, then maybe you have to make some trade-offs and you have to do the windows and seal them up right and do the best you can, right? Not everybody's going to be able to do the ideal thing. Right. In another situation, you might be willing to do everything, but maybe you have a brownstone in a city, and you don't want to rip out the inside, but you were considering putting something on the outside because there are systems now where you can put the insulation on the outside. But the zoning won't allow it. They don't want you spoiling the street full of brownstones with that. So there are a lot of considerations, and you should get some help, and you should ask a lot of questions and be careful who you hire.
So I start with an energy audit and then use that to make the determination about the windows or the insulation and make good, solid consumer decisions. So that actually raises a good, interesting tie-in, and that is the question of trade-offs that you raised. Do people really have enough information to make these kinds of informed choices about products and services these days? Rather than hiring the person to do the work, what about buying the materials? How do you think we have the consumer knowledge we need to be truly green?
Well, I think that's a difficult one, because a lot of the progressive companies are trying very hard to green their supply chains. Mm-hmm. And, it invites a certain amount of greenwashing too.
Yes. So
you have to be careful, and you have to, don't assume anything that's on the website of a big corporation, that was written by a public relations guy. Don't assume that. Check a little deeper. And find out if that's of interest to you. Going that deep sometimes isn't even necessary from my point of view. And from my point of view, I, as I've already expressed, I want to hit the highest energy users, and I want to hit them fast.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of companies exposing their supply chain, for instance, and talking about how much carbon is involved in moving a product from source to production to the consumer, I agree with you. That can be overkill for a lot of people. Do you think that's the kind of information that, especially with computer assistance, we could use to make better choices in the future?
Oh, absolutely. We have to go there eventually, and we are. One of the people who interviewed me yesterday asked me, "Are you optimistic?" And I said, "I'm optimistic about the directions we're going in, but I'm not necessarily optimistic about the momentum. We need a lot more momentum." And that applies directly to what you're discussing. When it comes up in the priority list to make sure that all of the supply chains are greened, well, then that's going to be very important. And I think for some companies, they are genuinely doing that. Some of the major retailers are doing a very good job of it.
Okay. Now, you're an optimist. What advice do you give to the media and teachers as well, because they're the other major influencers in this space, I believe, about how to tell the story? Should you focus on the pending disaster or on the opportunity? Because we're talking about a transition that could involve $29 to $30 trillion in investment. That sounds like a big opportunity. What do you recommend?
Absolutely. It's just technological change. It has been made into many other things, but primarily it's technological change, and there are huge opportunities for people who want to do some enterprise with this. There are many opportunities to start businesses. There are many opportunities to save on your capital budget. There are many opportunities to save on your utility and vehicle costs. Mm-hmm. So it is a good news story, and that's what we need to focus on. And sometimes in the media, we focus on the doom and gloom and the fires in the forest. And that's not wrong either. we do need to keep the problem in our minds.
Right.
However, for me, I started looking at solutions because I grew up in a family where it was of value to be useful. So I started looking at solutions early on, a couple decades ago, and it became my area of specialty. And so now that there are many voices who are making sure we know about the problem, and I want to be the voice who says, okay, now that you've accepted we need to act, here's a good way to act.
And I've been reading your blog, and you've got a lot of great articles, and they're always very timely. I've been very impressed looking at what you did on a daily basis. So let me ask, we'll take the optimist tack on this. What does success look like? What does the next economy look like to you? Can you paint a picture that people could?
Yes. I think the success looks like a place that begins with clean air, because the clean water problem is quickly bubbling up as the next huge problem. Mm-hmm. We all know about the oceans and the plastic and the landfill. We know about those problems. But if we don't clean the air, we're going to have agricultural problems, we're going to have more exacerbated water problems, and we're going to have disease wiping us out. We're going to have all the storms, all the floods. To some extent, those other secondary objectives will never come into relevance.
Right.
So I think success looks, first of all, like we clean up the power plants, as we seem to be doing. Mm-hmm. We seem to be moving well away from, and this is an economic development more than a political one, well away from the coal. Even the gas is now getting more expensive than wind and solar. Nuclear is way behind. It's very expensive. Yeah. If we clean up the cars, and I'm delighted to say that the last 2 years have been a big change in America, because all of a sudden now we have 300,000 electric vehicles sold in 2018 in the USA. That's impressive, and that's exciting. And we clean up the buildings, which is more of a challenge. It's harder for everyone, but at least we have in all three of these areas consensus from the experts. So just as we have consensus among the scientists about climate change, we also seem to have, in those three areas anyway, very good best practices consensus from the engineers, the architects, the government program managers.
Yeah, and I think translating how thoroughly that has been investigated and documented into something that consumers are going to be able to use is the next step in helping them amplify the use of their money to support the green movement.
Right.
So now you're at bfnagi.com. That is your website, and people can go check that out. And your book is The Clean Energy Future. It's published by Roman in Littlefield.
It's The Clean Energy Age. It's Roman in Littlefield, and if you decide that you want to order it, you can get a pre-Christmas discount by going to bfnagy.com. That's BFNAGY, and you will find a little promo code on there and a link to the Roman website. It's ROWMAN, Roman in Littlefield, but it's Roman.com. And that link and that promo code will get you 30% off on the book before December 25th.
And that's on the upper right-hand corner of your site. So I encourage everybody to check it out. Bruce, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us on sustainability in your ear today.
Thank you, Mitch.
Look forward to having you again. Well, that's another innovative interview, folks. We'll be back with another episode shortly. This is Earth 911 Sustainability in Your Ear, and I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. Have a great afternoon.